Okay, I'm on like my 20th take, and I'm Zayas. I am just a guy that does history as a hobby. I live in Utah, and I've always been fascinated with Utah history because a lot of people kind of just see Utah and they're like Mormons that are vaguely in this area, or not vaguely, but Mormons. that's kind of Utah's reputation. But there is a ton of interesting history here. There are so many ghost towns here. So this video is going to be my first video talking about ghost towns because I've always been fascinated by ghost towns. I'm not a historian or an archaeologist or nothing like that, but I'll link all my sources below. Feel free to give it a look over and do some research on your own. I highly recommend it. If I make a mistake, please correct me. I was inspired by the Mini Minuteman, and I just kind of figured out, hey, I'd make videos about stuff I've done research on and think is fun. And so today we're going to be talking about the wonderful ghost town, former Utopia, or advertised Utopia. There's a quote claiming it was the promised land. We'll get into that in a minute. But we're going to be talking about that today. Normally, I would like to film these videos, like either take or have pictures to show of the ghost town or film on site, depending on what's allowed. However, I could not get the rights to go to Mosida or use the photos. If you want to see photos of Mosida, I would recommend just typing it in or look at some of the blogs I'll have, these blogs I'll have sourced below. They have a ton of good photos on Mosida. But for now, for our purposes, we need to start in the Utah Valley. So, in Utah, we have the Utah Valley because we're great at naming things. And trust me, these names, they're going to be cooking this video. So, in Utah Valley, there is Utah Lake. And when pioneers first settled here, they settled on the east side, They settled on the east side of Utah Lake because that's where the rivers were. And these rivers were free irrigation for the pioneers, which was essential to setting up their cities and colonies at the time. So, everyone settled east of Utah Lake. Very few people settled west because there were no such rivers, and so there was no irrigation. However, 62 years later, in 1909, three businessmen, saw a vision. You see, at this point, there was technology that was not available to the pioneers. There was water pumps, and several power plants had been established in the area that could power the water pumps, that could then pull water directly from Utah Lake itself. So, these three businessmen, Morrison, Simpson, and Davis, let me just double check that. Hold. Yes. This is why I have a script. But they came up with the idea for a place called Mosida by the lake. We'll just call it Mosida for now. Mosida uses the first two letters of each of their names. I'm not even joking, that's where the word Mosida comes from. Also, if it's Mosida or Moseda, don't at me, okay? I'm trying. And so they came up with this idea to start a settlement on the west side of Utah Lake, which is almost entirely unpopulated. So, they bought the land from the Utah State Land Board, and then they managed to sell this project with the land to a group of promoters, investors called the Mosida Fruitlands Company. And keep in mind, the name of the settlement is Mosida, which is named after the three guys that came up with the idea. It's called Mosida by the lake, because it's a settlement on the lake, and it is now owned by the Mosida Fruitlands Company, who wanted to use it to sell land to grow fruit, because names. And so, the idea for Mosida was started, basically. Work began, and the Mosida Company, as I'll be calling them for short for now, began building their pump houses, digging ditches, installing pumps. They built housing for workers, and workers began to dig and plant the apple and peach seeds for the fruit they wanted to grow. And now that the work on this farmland was well on its way, this company needed to make money, because this is all going to be real expensive. So, the idea is they need to sell all this land to homesteaders, farmers, people that want to grow fruit in Utah. and so they began their pretty active advertising campaign. Quick little disclaimer here: when talking about the irrigation ditches and the pumps, their waterhistory.org has a fantastic article going over like the specs and like the specific details. Excuse me. Of these irrigation canals and everything. Wow. Waterhistory.org just stole all my water. Good heavens. But if you want more information, I'll have their article linked below as they go over a lot of the technical stuff that kind of just goes right over my head. But by the time 1912 had rolled around, a lot of the work had been done. 30,000 fruit trees had been planted, and it was gaslighting time. The Mosida company was claiming that these trees were just popping out of the ground. They were just everywhere. They were claiming that a lot of these trees were almost big enough to grow fruit, which is kind of believable. I mean, it'd been 3-ish years. A lot of those fruit trees take 3 to 5 years to grow, so all right, we'll give it to them. However, there begins to be some problems. Hooking buyers was key to making a profit, and so one of the things about the history of Mosida is a lot of the advertising was fair. Like in the moment, all this glazing of Mosida, like this new settlement they were doing, was fair if everything went exactly according to plan. And history has taught us that that never happens. So, although I kind of make fun of them for, like, some of the wild and wacky advertisements they did, it's not unreasonable to say that this company did see a lot of potential and hope in Mosida that it would actually be a profitable place. Some of their promises, like it being a investment in the Promised Land, which is something they actually said, are a little hard to, verify with numbers, but given that it's now a ghost town, it's kind of, I don't think it was the Promised Land. But, hey, that's a conversation for another day. I wouldn't, But Mosida was, and this is a quote, was advertised at first as a wonderfully attractive place for a permanent home and a splendid opportunity for investment, which at the time seemed fair. They were claiming there was going to be plentiful water, cheap energy bills, and future industry, including like a canning center for the fruit they were going to be growing. The soil was rich and deep, and I do want to kind of give them crap because of the way everything turned out. But some people, like historian Raymond Steele, they kind of pointed out that, and this is a quote from Raymond Steele himself, their representations were fair and honorable as far as they were able to see at the time. And yeah, like I said, that's pretty fair. So the company continued to promote, and one of the best ways that they did this was they established a luxury hotel in Mosida. And this had 16 rooms, steam heating, all the luxuries the 1910s could offer. And the view was impeccable. Now, see, I grew up on the west side of Utah Lake, and it is gorgeous. The view, immaculate. So, imagine in the 1910s, you are on the west side of Utah Lake in a luxury hotel with steam heating. The view of the calm Utah Lake is beautiful. You can see the settlements there on the east side. There's going to be plenty of room, cheap water and energy, plenty of land to grow your crops. It seems like a utopia. However, disconnected as it was from the rest of Utah, there is only one way to get to transportation to and from the rest of Utah, and that was a large boat across Utah Lake. They had one barge, and they built a little boat launch for it. And this barge was the only way to and from the major settlements in Utah. So, it's a little rough, but the nice thing is, it's Utah Lake. It's 12 feet deep. It's not that serious. The calm conditions of the lake normally meant the barge was pleasant and enjoyable when you were crossing the lake. Buyers were given tours, promised fair prices, fancy cooks were hired. A lot of parties were held on like the barge itself. So imagine a party atop this little barge they have. Houses were built, kind of trying to still pull in more people and settlers. The company built a post office, a store, and a school, all to support the buyers. And then good news came. And I know this is kind of a whirlwind. The the history of Mosida is this interesting thing where it's everyone was seeing as potential. Buyers were excited. The company was doing its best to hype up the land. And in the moment, everything seemed too good to be true almost. Because it was. But, for example, 2 railroad companies were interested in developing land in Mosida. So, boom, right there, industry coming in. The company lowered prices to entice more buyers. Plot sizes increased as they just started to hit a fever pitch. Another quote we have here, this is a little bit later in their advertising: the investor and home seeker will do well to visit Mosida by the lake. Or, in my favorite quote, it, meaning Mosida, has been recognized as a veritable garden spot of the promised land. Yeah, so people were excited. There was a lot going for Mosida. And by the end of 1913, almost 400 people had bought land. Most of them were homesteaders. Wells would provide the water for people and farm animals. Water pumps provided the water for the crops. And the future was looking bright. I mean, and to be honest, for the people, yeah, there was no reason to not think the future would be bright. They'd been sold the promise of a simple but profitable life. And people partied on the barge. People hunted coyotes. Life was good. But then cracks began to show. And in 1915, one Mr. Burst lost his wagon of 3,000 bales of hay, along with a team of mules. This happened because he would send his carts across the frozen Utah Lake. This was an easy way to transport his hay bales to the city of Provo, which was across the lake. However, every time he sent his wagon across the lake, there was cracking ice. And so he tried his best to save his wagon. But then he ultimately lost it. And while a minor incident, this incident kind of proved to be like a foreshadowing for Mosida itself. If you remember, there was only one way across the lake for the people in Mosida, and it was that barge, that boat. It had been used for transportation, the parties, and was one of the key players of the morale and, like, industry and infrastructure of Mosida. It caught fire in 1913. It burnt completely. And that obviously caused a ton of problems to the people in Mosida. And it cost the company thousands of dollars. And keep in mind, this is in 1909, or, well, this is in 1913, sorry. That's a lot of money. And the thing is, the Mosida company was still in debt. They hadn't sold enough of the land to be profitable. And despite optimistic projections and corporate readjusting, they were spiraling. Residents were beginning to become discontent as a plague of grasshoppers was destroying crops. They were, especially the alfalfa, was just getting destroyed by these grasshoppers. And so the company continued to slip. And in 1915 and 1916, residents began to go to court to air out their grievances. They weren't being provided with enough water. And a deal with the electric company ended up costing a lot more than the crops from the land made that year. And that drove the company further into the red. So electricity is getting expensive. There's not enough water to go around. Things are melting down and people are freaking out. In 1917, the company's desperate. So some people start throwing out ideas. So one idea was to farm sugar beets, which would be more profitable. However, that fizzled out and the people were done. Even the state of Utah, like the government, tried to step in and help, and it secured power for the residents, but it could not save the settlement. The grasshoppers were just harassing everyone, making everything worse. And with the trust in the company itself that owned this land eroding, people just began to leave. And the town of Mosida was dying. People kept throwing out proposals to save the town and the dream of Mosida. But farmers weren't willing to pay for the land. I mean, who would be? You're a guy on the other side of the lake, and all you've heard is there's not enough water to go around. There's not enough electricity for the pumps. There's grasshoppers destroying all the crops. We're losing 3,000 bales of hay in the lake after our boat burns down, right? Or the ice cracks. No one wants to put an investment here anymore. And so Mosida was essentially dead by 1919. A few people stuck around, but the last resident left in 1924. So in essentially just a dozen years or so, Mosida went from, and let's read that quote again, a veritable garden spot of the promised land to its last resident leaving. That is crazy. And as said, there was a lot of potential, The idea of there's tons of land over here that no one else is using. Growing these profitable fruit trees, cheap water, cheap energy. But ultimately, the company of Mosida kind of promised above its pay grade, and it couldn't match the expectations, and because of that, people left, and the company kind of just collapsed. Now, all that remains of Mosida is ruins. If you see the photos, it's all just old wells and basements that remain, some crumbling walls where buildings once stood. And another about 80 years later, Saratoga Springs was formed 18 miles north of where Mosida was. Saratoga Springs is one of the fastest growing cities in Utah. I used to live in and about that area. And when I lived there, in about a period of 2 years, the population of Saratoga Springs doubled. Now, I no longer live there, but it's crazy to me to go back there and see how much things have changed. And the reason Saratoga Springs is succeeding where Mosida failed 80 years ago is just because of the advances in technology. We no longer need to grow food over on the west side of Utah Lake. We can import it, and that alone cures so many problems. And, it's funny to think, maybe the men that planned Mosida, they weren't really charlatans. Like we said, there was potential. Maybe they were just ahead of their time. They just saw a vision of something they couldn't quite reach in their hands. And so it's a fun memory to look back on, kind of this town that grew up and died and sort of the remnants of a capitalist fever dream. A hope for something that was just too good. Either way, don't get too far ahead of yourself, or all that'll be left of your dreams will be ruins. Also, grasshoppers suck. Thanks for watching my first video, and I'll see you in the next one.